Hi, I'm Ellen Condliffe Lagemann, Dean of the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and I'm delighted to welcome you to this forum on education for all. In election seasons like this, we sometimes talk about the educational challenges we face in this country, which are very large and very urgent. But it is humbling when you think about the educational challenges around the world. That's going to be the topic for tonight's discussion, and there are four absolutely wonderful panelists who will talk about that, so I will leave it to them. I just want to say a quick word of thanks to Professor Fernando Reimers, who is director of our International Education Program. Fernando does everything. He teaches, he advises, he travels, he writes, he consults. He's multiply talented, and we thank him for all that he does for the Ed School. Other than thanking Fernando, my only job is to introduce the president of Harvard University, Larry.
Ellen, thank you for the splendid leadership that you're providing to the school. Fernando, thank you for your leadership in this program and for the many things you do to promote understanding in the education area at Harvard and around the world. I want to just speak for a couple of minutes and say a couple things about your topic this afternoon, and then have the honor of introducing the members of your panel, some of whom are close friends of mine. The paper that Ellen referred to made a strong argument, and one that I actually continue to believe 13 years later. And that is this. If you think about the full social return on different investments in the developing world, investments in plant and equipment, investments in infrastructure, investments in other things, that there's a strong case that the highest return investment available in the developing world is an investment in the primary and secondary education of young girls. Part of the return to that investment is pecuniary in the form of the higher earnings that those who are better educated have. Much of the return is social. Judged purely as a health program, primary education looks pretty good. Judged purely as a family planning program, primary education for girls looks pretty good. Judged purely as a program for reducing maternal mortality, primary education for girls looks pretty good. Judged as all of the above, which it is an extraordinarily high returned investment. There are other aspects that even we economists shudder to attempt to quantify, having to do with social attitudes and the broad character of societies. But nothing that has happened in the last 13 years has called into question the view that the potential social transformational impacts of more girls' education in the Islamic world are very profound. You know, as Amartya Sen was the first to highlight quite some number of years ago, now, in countries like the United States, or in countries like many in Africa, there are between 100 and 105 women in the population for every man. In other parts of the world, and particularly in those parts of the world where girls are least likely to be educated, there are 90 or 92 or 94 or 95 women for every 100 people in the population. That is a staggering toll. And if you look at the aggressiveness internally and externally of those societies, if you look at the progress they have made, you see, with a lack of progress they have suffered, you see an enormous toll. So this is an issue that I would hope has become an issue of not why, not whether, but only how. And that's why I think we're very fortunate to have here today a set of experts who in different ways have given enormous thought and exerted enormous influence over the world's path on these issues. Vivian Stewart, who is the one member of this panel who I haven't had a chance to get to know before, is the Vice President for Education at the Asia Society. She's responsible for the Asia Society's work with national and state policymakers, with schools, teachers, and curriculum developers to promote the study of Asia and other world regions, cultures, and languages. Before coming to the Asia Society, she directed the education and child development programs at the Carnegie Corporation of New York, where she helped to shape reform agendas in early childhood education, urban school reform, and a number of other areas. She was involved with the Carnegie Task Force, which produced the influential report, Turning Points, A Matter of Time, and Starting Points. She has also written reports for the UN High Commissioner on refugees, on the crucial question of access for education to refugees. Carol Bellamy has been the executive director of the United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, since 1995, where she has become a champion of global investment in children, arguing that such investments are central to reducing poverty and building a more secure world. She encouraged the General Assembly to allow children to take part in the UN special session on children in May of 2002, and hundreds did, meeting directly with heads of state to discuss the issues affecting their lives. Ms. Bellamy has visited more than 100 countries, advocating for children and women with heads of state, cultural icons, corporate leaders, rebel commanders, and many others. The results of her many efforts can be found in UN Secretary General Kofi Annan's 2001 report, We the Children, perhaps the most comprehensive picture of the global child that has ever been assembled. Carol Bellamy comes to her position at UNICEF with great leadership experience. The former director of the United States Peace Corps, a Peace Corps volunteer herself, possessor of a distinguished career in the private sector at Bear Stearns and Morgan Stanley, and 13 years of experience as an elected official, including 5 years in the New York State Senate and the presidency of the New York City Council. New York City Council, a position she held until 1985. And finally, and most important, Carol Bellamy is a former fellow of the Institute of Politics at Harvard University. I've known Gene Sperling for a long time. Gene currently does many different things. It's a reflection of the breadth of his interest, that he comments for Bloomberg on financial matters, that he pursues passionately his interests in universal literacy, that he served as the inspiration for Josh Lyman on West Wing, and that he has contributed any number of scripts to West Wing. Bill Clinton called him the most valuable player on his economic team, and Gene served in the White House on the National Economic Council from the first hour that President Clinton arrived in the White House until the last hour when he left. And Gene was in the thick of every economic issue with which the Clinton administration dealt, whether it was the WTO agreement with China or whether it was his force of personality and his persistence that led to a huge increase in the earned income tax credit, which is probably the most important thing that the United States has done for the working poor in the last 15 years. Gene became very interested in this set of issues around universal education in connection with one of the G7 summits, and made a very thorough study of it, pushed the United States to make larger commitments than it otherwise would have, and in a way that I must say is quite uncharacteristic of White House staffers, stayed with the issue long after the press had lost interest, traveling during President Clinton's last year to Africa to pursue this vitally important set of issues. Elaine Wolfensohn is an education specialist. She spent more than 30 years working in the field of education with a particular interest in girls' education. What is remarkable about Elaine is the difference she has made over nearly a decade now at the World Bank in bringing these issues to the forefront. Elaine has visited every continent on multiple occasions, has visited dozens, if not 100 countries, and has always asked very basic questions. What's being done for primary education? Are girls being treated fairly? What are the barriers to having more? What can the bank do? Her husband, Jim, has driven and pushed the bank ever more strongly into the crucial social areas. But as he has done that, Elaine has been, in a real sense, the conscience of the bank, always asking whether what's being done isn't just a good press release, isn't just a policy that adds up in accounting terms, but whether it's really going to change the lives of young girls and boys around the world. And there are literally tens of thousands, if not millions, of children who are better off for Elaine's efforts and for the efforts of those on our panel. And we're all very glad to welcome them here today. Thank you very much.
Larry, thank you very much. Thank you, Dr. Rimas. I wish, in fact, we had helped. Maybe we've helped some, but I think for the students here today, the challenge is how much more you can still do. In coming here today, I thought that I would share with you the two countries I have just visited. As Larry said, I do spend my time traveling around the world, but mainly I spend my time in schools in every country I go to. I observe the schools, I meet with teachers, ministers, and I talk to students and parents. And over the 10 years, I've seen some perfectly wonderful schools, but more often than not, I see some very poor schools. And since I just came from two of the poorest countries on earth, Madagascar and Ethiopia, I thought I would share with you those schools, what I saw there, and which are representative in many ways of what I see many places. And then how those schools can change, because I've seen other schools move from that low level to a much higher level. And hopefully through all of this to challenge you to enter into the field, because much as there's a challenge in America, which we all recognize, I think the greatest challenge is in the developing world. I shall speak primarily of exclusion because of poverty and quality of education. I cannot ignore language of learning. You can assume that in all the cases, the challenges are greater for girls than for boys. I would also like to say a few words about the negative impact of wars on education, because when we speak of poverty, we will also speak of countries in conflict. Since I've just returned from Madagascar and Ethiopia, as I describe these visits, you will hear how poverty, education quality, and language of learning collude to prevent children from learning. Madagascar has a single indigenous language, Malgache, which is rather rare in a developing country. A place like Mali or Bamako in Mali, I think, has 82 indigenous languages. I visited a rural school in Madagascar near the port city of Tomasina and observed a third grade class reading together in French about les maladies de la peau, skin infections. What was remarkable is that they could all read French. What was more common is that they didn't understand a word they were reading, nor did they understand a question that the teacher was asking. Were they the lucky ones? Sure, they were at school. Many in Madagascar are not at school, and it will take a lot to get them to school. I'm not sure it will happen in this decade. After some time, the teacher began to explain the meaning of the passage in Malgache with a good discussion of the importance of hygiene to avoid various diseases. Although the children were fortunate to be at school, the teacher didn't actually have the skills either to teach them the language of learning, which eventually is French. They moved to French in third grade. Nor was the textbook suited to their level either in French or even in Malgache, had it been in Malgache. It was way above their level. As I said, this class was better than many I've observed around the world because the teacher at least spoke the indigenous language and the language of learning. And in many countries, that's rare. Because of poverty, however, the children in this classroom were probably both hungry and malnourished, like most children in Madagascar. And as you probably all know, when you go to school on an empty stomach, it's very difficult to learn. In Ethiopia, the situation was a little more complicated. Children begin learning in one of 20 indigenous languages. There are others, but they've limited the language of learning to 20. The cost is so expensive. And then they change to English in either third or fourth grade. The teachers I observed, who were responsible for introducing the children to English, had almost no knowledge of English language. Although the average class size in Ethiopia is 75, the classes I visited in Addis Ababa had been reduced to 50. These were both a formal school and an alternative education center, but they shared many of the same problems. They had 2 shifts, and one teacher taught the morning and the afternoon shift, which means a teacher was dealing with a minimum of probably 200 students a day. The children were mostly children of weavers who were among the poorest of urban Ethiopians. And again, we'll discuss later, I think, the importance of attending versus not attending schools. And these are the lucky children because they're attending schools. But you have to feel when you're there, until they put quality teaching and better textbooks into these schools, there is no chance that these children will make it. There's no chance that they're going to pass the exam for 5th grade to move on. Now, these are the 2 most recent countries I've visited. And what they share with many countries in the developing world is poverty and the poor quality of teaching because of poverty, as well as inappropriate curriculum and textbooks, and in addition, language of learning problems. I hope you all read the New York Times this past Sunday, which quite vividly brought to everyone's attention the problem of schools in Africa. Fortunately, in the 10 years, I have seen extraordinary change in education. And I actually believe that Madagascar and Ethiopia can be among the countries that overcome obstacles to learning. Why? They have leaders who are committed to education and governments that are working well with the donors. Both countries recognize the importance of capacity building at all levels to make education work, but they will also need greater financial investment into their systems. Poverty causes many of weaknesses in education, but lack of education contributes to poverty. Likewise, war is a cause of poverty, but it is also more likely to occur in countries already suffering from economic problems. Ethiopia, for example, is emerging from a conflict with Eritrea that has certainly set it back, but will hopefully serve as a catalyst for progress, which can also happen after a conflict. The consequences of conflict can, however, set in place a vicious cycle by reducing the opportunities for education, thus perpetuating poverty, and making renewed conflict more likely. Of the 15 African countries with the lowest enrollment rates, 10 are suffering or emerging from conflict. Hopefully, as countries achieve education for all, one of the Millennium Development Goals, the cycle of conflict will also be broken. Of course, international financial contributions as well as national commitment will be necessary. Have countries begun to address education for peace? Not enough. As I observed reconciliation programs in a school in Rwanda 2 years ago, I wondered how a similar approach throughout the country before the conflict might have avoided the terrible genocide. Through drama and music, as well as other educational materials, students learned about their ancient and more recent history in a very inclusive way. Sadly, hate is still in education in many, many parts of the world, as we all know. Sometimes conflict can influence communities to take education into their own hands. During the Civil War in El Salvador, peasants created schools for their children that answered to local needs. Because of community involvement and inclusiveness, these schools empowered the teachers, the students, and the parents, and became the model for state schools in El Salvador and some neighboring countries when the fighting stopped. Other countries, like India, looked at the statistical analysis and realized that they had to change their education system. And I must say, in creating the district primary education program for rural communities over a decade ago, India confronted head-on both weaknesses in rural education and especially weaknesses on girls' education. And in a very holistic way, they worked with communities, with teachers, with specialists from around the world, with their own experts, with NGOs, and they created for a huge country a change in education that the states themselves could adapt. Like all education programs, it confronts problems. But in fact, there's been a huge increase in girls' attendance at schools. There's been an enormous change in quality of teachers. It's much less top-down. It's a much more interactive education. The textbooks are more appropriate. And it's wonderful to see in a country the size of India that type of model that can really address the poorest of the poor. I'd like to dwell for one moment on this question of gender-based exclusion. Larry referred to his truly seminal work in 1992 in a piece called Investing in All the People, which has had an influence beyond any other probably in the last decade on educating girls, in understanding what girls' education does, not just for education, not just for girls, but for families, for the village, for the community, and for the country. The study argues that education of girls may provide the highest return of investment available in the developing world. And I think many of us would agree. I certainly agree with the assessment and would like to underline here for all of you the importance that the strong analytical research he did is the way to contribute most to education. Recent research has shown progress on the gender front. Girls' enrollments are trending upwards. 30 years ago, girls represented 38% of primary enrollments in low-income countries, and boys represented 62%. Today, girls represent 45%, to boys 55%. Girls' gross enrollment rate for girls in low-income countries have gone from 52% to 88% during that period. A remarkable achievement, but still not good enough. Time is too short to go into the detail the topic deserves, but I would like to mention 3 policies promoted by the international community, which I believe are somewhat overdue for reassessment. The first is the narrow focus on girls' enrollment. Too many of us have accepted the argument that if we just get the girls into the classroom, the rest will take care of itself. Well, the rest does not just take care of itself. Getting girls into the classroom does matter, but what happens once they get into the classroom is paramount. And the evidence is piling up that girls are still being excluded even when they've made it through the door. They're being excluded from learning, and that's what we care about. In both the PISA and the Pearl studies of developed countries, girls outperformed boys in reading in every country. But the evidence in the PASIC studies in 19 countries in Africa found girls significantly ahead of boys in only one country, the most developed. Likewise, in the SACMEC assessment of learning in 14 countries from Central and Southern Africa, girls were ahead of boys in reading in only the 4 most developed countries. Something is not happening. A second policy due for reassessment is the narrow focus of most development agencies on primary school girls. It is important, of course, to continue to pay attention to these girls, but much more needs to be done at the post-primary levels. Now that primary school attendance for girls has increased. This, after all, is where the most severe gender imbalances occur. Guinea is typical. Girls now represent 43% of all enrollments in primary school. But at the secondary level, girls represent only 27%, and at the tertiary level, 12%. We all know the benefits that accrue to women when they have primary school education, but they are much greater with secondary education. The third policy that I would want to address has to do with the failure to understand and address children with disabilities. Children with disability are far more likely than any other group of children to be excluded from schools. Within this group, girls with disability are even more likely to be excluded than boys. But these girls will be missed if we pay attention only to gender. So we must understand and address disability itself, and then within this focus, seek to understand the gender issues. Broad-based advocacy focused on girls will always have its place and will always be needed, but it is not enough. Let me return for a moment to the broader challenges related to exclusion. It is not only in Africa and Southern Asia that certain groups have been marginalized. Each region of the world has excluded one or more groups. In Europe, and especially Eastern Europe, the Roma have been marginalized in society in general, and equally in education. At the meeting in Budapest in 2003, their number one request was integration in education. In order to do that, different countries are looking at ways of training teachers, changing textbooks, getting rid of the stereotypes, so that Roma can become part of the mainstream in the many countries where they live. Before closing, let me add one more remedy to exclusion in education. All children, but especially those in developing countries, especially girls and especially the children of the poor, need to have a nurturing physical and emotional environment, as well as cognitive stimulation in the early years. Quality early childhood development is one important way to ensure that girls as well as boys have equal opportunities to be healthy, physically, emotionally, and mentally from the very beginning. As you embark on your careers in education, hopefully you will seek ways to give every child in the world the opportunity to go to school with enough food in his stomach and the knowledge and confidence to succeed. More effective and new solutions must be found for the language of learning, and around the world, teachers need adequate preparation to help them succeed in conveying the tools of learning to a new generation. At the same time, to avoid repeating the wars and conflicts of the past century, I hope you will all seek new ways to educate children for peace, and I wish you luck.
We've all been told when to speak here, so I think I'm next. If anybody knows me, you will know that I don't really pander to people, but I must say after almost 10 years at UNICEF and 2 years prior to that at the Peace Corps, to be in a room with Larry Summers after we've all quoted him so many times is really quite extraordinary because, in fact, Larry, to you we owe a great debt in terms, those of us who are passionate about the issues of girls' education, to be able to remind people. I used to say, having spent 7 years as an investment banker, that I used to be asked for good investment advice, and it wasn't until I got to development that I could give good investment advice, because if you want to invest somewhere that you have a real return on your investment, it's making sure that girls go to school. And the person that helped us along in that process was Larry Summers. So Larry, thank you very much for that. That's not what I'm supposed to talk about, but since he's still sitting in the room, I thought I would begin there. We decided that Elaine would start because she'd give you a real sense of what we're talking about. And now I'm going to talk a little bit more about the chapeau of where we are, and then a few other comments. So where is the world community on education? Well, we keep saying we're going to do something about it. Back in 1990, at a meeting in Jomtien, the heads of governments gathered together and committed themselves to assure that all children got an education. Education for all, EFA. You know, in development, we don't speak in words, we just speak in letters. So EFA. And then, and that same year, there was also the World Summit for Children, where world leaders came together and said, all children will get an education. And then 10 years later, and there were other meetings in between, but 10 years later at the Millennium Summit in 2000, where the largest number, after the World Summit for Children, the largest number of heads of state, not just functionaries, but heads of state, heads of government came together at the Millennium Summit. Once again, there was a confirmation by them of the commitment to assuring that all children, boys and girls, get an education, and that goal of education for all by the year of 2015 needed to be met. This is a goal to which heads of state and heads of government need to be kept, their feet to the fire. Those that will provide the resources and those who will provide the investment. And so this Millennium Development Goal of education for all, complemented by an Millennium Development Goal, and Elaine mentioned it, the Millennium Development Goals. This was the Millennium Summit. There were 8 goals that came out of this summit, one of which is a confirmation of education for all. Another is gender parity, so you bring that together, that means girls' education. And there are some others that contribute to this. This is the blueprint for global development today. So if one has, it's not 477 different things, it's 8 things, of which one is absolutely education and one is gender parity. So you bring those two together, it's all kids in school, and we're also going to make sure that all kids means girls. So this is the commitment that the global community has made. So it's worth taking a look at where we are at this point. Well, the good news is that there are more children in school today than at any other time before. The bad news is that population growth, and we're not talking about population explosion, we're just talking about population growth, has continued. And so in terms of improvement in access to education, there have been some good places, as Elaine has pointed out, but there are still major challenges. And it's still estimated that there are over 100 million children, school-age children, basically primary school-age children worldwide, are not in school today, and that about a little less than 60%, not quite 60%, are girls. So there's still more of a female gender gap, but it's not only girls who are not in school today. And so how do we overcome this? Well, a couple comments on this. And I'm going to agree and not disagree with Elaine, but I'm going to put a little different emphasis in some cases. And we decided to do this because we thought maybe you'd ask some questions about this, or you'd challenge us a little bit about this. If we all agreed on everything, it would be really totally boring. So, what are some of the issues here? Well, I mean, there are issues of investment. If you look, there's still too little investment by the developing and transitional countries themselves in their own educational systems, and to the extent to which they are investing, it's largely in teachers' salaries. Too little, quite frankly, but virtually nothing for the educational system itself. It's largely salaries at this point. Discrimination continues to be a matter that exists, and particularly for girls. Remember the debate, if you followed it several years ago, and even in Uganda, where the president of Uganda said 4 children in every family will go, and then there was this big debate. Well, what if there are 6 kids and 4 of them are boys? Do the boys all go, or should it be 2 boys, 2 girls? And this was a big debate. That's an issue. Financing is an issue for children, and it isn't just school fees, although school fees still consist. Even things like school uniforms. In the poorest of families, if you're going to only have a couple of, if you can only afford a couple of uniforms, who do you provide the uniforms for, the boys or the girls? And more often than not, the boys will receive the uniforms. And even when everybody's going to school, China has a policy that all children will go to school. We did a review. All kids are going to school, except the girls get less sleep because after school and before school they have these errands and those things, and they have to do other things. So that's not even excluding the girls, but realizing that the girls are less able to do well in school because they have so many other kinds of challenges. I don't mean the boys are sitting around, but the girls have additional challenges. And then there are other things. I mean, Elaine mentioned, poverty has historically been a major challenge to any kind of system functioning and remains a major challenge to systems functioning. But we've confronted over the last 10 to 15 years two other things that existed even back in 1980 but not fully taken into account, and not even fully taken into account in 1990, and that is the increasing implications of conflict in the world today, because the nature of war is increasingly changing. It's increasingly not between countries, it's within countries. It's increasingly not military, it's many factions. It's increasingly just tearing apart countries. And the victims are increasingly civilian and not military, and so your systems stop to function. So war has enormous implications on education systems functioning. And HIV/AIDS, the worst catastrophe, at least in our view, to hit the world, has had enormous implications on education. Little country, but Lesotho did a recent study, and they concluded that virtually 50% of their teachers would be dead within the next 5 years. So, and Zambia has more teachers dying every year than they're able to train. And so it's not, and not to mention the teachers who were hitting on the girls in the classroom and infecting them. So you have many implications in education from the HIV/AIDS situation. That being said, I don't want to leave with just negative, and I'm trying to keep to time here. I also believe there are things that can be done. We also believe that there are things that can be done to make a difference. And I'm going to mention a couple, and then I'm going to conclude on one other point. Abolishing school fees. We believe passionately in the issue of abolishing school fees, and not just school fees, but all the hidden fees, whether they are school uniforms or other kinds of things, school books, costs for school books, and opportunity costs to ensure access for school. And I brought with me, or I didn't, but my Heidi did, the front page of the New York Times. And I'm sure most of my friends looked at this picture. I don't know whether you can see it, with all these kids sitting on the floor, no desks, no chairs, totally a horrible situation in some ways, with all these kids in one classroom. And frankly, I want to argue this is not a bad picture. This is Kenya, and they abolished the school fees, and about 1.5 million more kids, boys and girls, came to school. Is this good or bad? Well, if you read the article, it's both good and bad. All these kids came to school. They don't have more teachers. They don't know what to do. There are too many kids in the classroom. But the kids came to school. And the fact is, that's not good enough. And I agree. I think for too long we've emphasized just the EFA, Education for All, enrollment. It's like you had a little zipper. You know what they do on the planes? They count you when you get on the plane. You come in and you walk through the door and they count your number. They walk up and down the aisles and they count how many people are in the plane, and that's all that counts. Well, I don't think it is just going through the front door, and enrollment shouldn't be enough. And quality education has to play a role. But the fact is, if you don't get the kids in the first place, you'll never even get the pressure to have the quality education. So it is critical, I think, that we move in global education to completion, not just enrollment. But until you get enrollment, you're never going to get the pressure to have completion. And so I think we don't wait to assure that we're hitting some level of quality to argue for those clicks that'll help us get enrollment. And one of them is abolishing school fees and hidden fees. 2, birth registration. Might sound really crazy and they're really boring, except if you don't exist, they don't have to create a system for you. And so efforts to go out there and make sure that all children are at least registered at some point so that they know they exist means that you exist in the eyes of a society so that so that the system, whether it's the health system or something else, doesn't have to respond to you, but at least has to take you into account in terms of its statistics. Legal frameworks around education. And one of the key legal frameworks, I would argue today, is the legal framework that says children who've been orphaned as a result of AIDS need to be able to go to school, and girls who've given birth to babies need to be able to go to school. If we're going to talk about children going to school, because and not that a legal framework alone will assure you go to school, but unless you have that legal framework, sometimes you can't go out there and make sure that children go to school. Subsidizing household income, I'm almost finished here, is also something that we've seen experiences, whether it's a Bolsa Escola in Brazil, or a similar program, I forget what it's called, Oportunidades in Mexico, which is to, what is it, Gene? Yeah, which is basically it's a Becca, I've lost my English. It's a scholarship to the family, if you will, for children going to school, and it helps get children out of child labor. But there has to be an assurance that the children are going to school, and I think we have to look for these resource transfers as possibilities. And then safety and security, something that we may or may not take for granted in this country, but safety and security, which may mean how close the schools are to where the children live, because we know increasingly the violence particularly against girls, is growing around the world today. Violence in the schools itself, but certainly violence on the way to the schools, or even the security in the school, whether it's the availability of sanitary facilities for both. I'll just finish by saying again that I just wanted to throw things out so we will at least have something to discuss. To say that I think none of us should be satisfied with an educational environment that merely creates a construct that is almost like a movie set, that maybe you go to school but you don't learn anything. On the other hand, I think unless we create an environment in which there is at least the opportunity for everyone to go to school, there will not be the pressure to assure that we reach a situation where we begin to deal with quality. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Jean Sperling, as introduced by Larry, and I am honored to be here. I too am meeting Vivian Stewart for the first time, but I will say that many of the speakers here have been very influential to me. I, like many others, first heard the phrase that investing in girls was the best social return in the world from Larry Summers in 1992, and I'm proud that we did not do enough, or not proud that we did not do enough, but Larry was the most tireless fighter for the debt relief effort, and I think we in the White House got in board full steam in 2000 and pushed through that legislation, but that was perhaps one of the most important things we did to free up money for education. And so Larry, while he had to deal with some small things like the Asian financial crisis when he was there, did not forget his passion for development and putting that into action in what really was the most significant bipartisan development in aid, and I think set a path for some of the progress that happened after 9/11. Carol Bellamy, if you said girls' education, Carol Bellamy. That's just what you think around the world. The fact that she has many issues at UNICEF, she made that their flagship, their focus, and it's had just a tremendous impact. And we see each other everywhere as we trip along, but she is there and has had enormous impact in putting what we're talking about in action. I just hit something, so that looks nice. Now, Elaine Wolfensohn, I have to tell the story if anybody wants to know whether she does truly go around. I was in Tanzania, and where they also have eliminated fees and have reform, and I went into a school, and I have a set of questions I often ask kids, and I asked them, so what Americans do you know? And they did the translation. And the first kid put up his hand, and just as you'd predict, said Michael Jordan. And the next kid, just as you predict, said Michael Jackson. Now, you're just about the part where you usually get maybe, Arnold Schwarzenegger or something. And the third person, a young woman, put up her hand and said, Elaine Wolfensohn. So I kind of looked over at the teacher, Michael Jackson, Michael Jordan, Elaine Wolfensohn. He said, she was here recently. Jompton in 1990 was where they first created the Education for All. The trip that Larry talked about was when I led the U.S. delegation in 2000 to Dakar. Dakar was like after you have failed with one, you realize you're not going to reach the goal, so we set it again. And 182 countries, 182 from Iraq and Iran to the U.S. and Great Britain agreed with the goal, universal primary education by 2015. It is simultaneously the world's most ambitious and pathetic goal. It is ambitious because today as we speak, only 36 of 155 developing countries are on path. It is pathetic because whenever a child asks me, why only primary education and why not till 2015, I never have an answer because it is so pathetic. And yet, there is so much that can be done. This is a silent crisis. You do not see CNN cameras ever show you a child dying from not reading. You don't ever see somebody dying from not getting education like you might from AIDS or hunger, but rest assured, children die, babies die, mothers die all over the world because of a lack of education. And much of the stuff, of the information that Larry talked about and spoke about gives you very compelling arguments. And I'm not going to go through them all, but when Larry said nothing in the last 13 years, I think if I can do a little propaganda, but for good cause, what we have out here is Barbara Herz, who worked with Larry at the World Bank, and myself tried to put together all the literature. And what you'd see is that the literature is even more profound since Larry gave his seminal speech on his seminal report on all the different ways that education helps for AIDS prevention, how much a year prevents infant mortality, maternal mortality, all of those issues. And I will not go through all those, but just to give you a couple of numbers that I think just should bother us. 55% of girls in Africa do not graduate from primary school. 55%. That's the average. So if you imagine what that statistic would be for rural girls or poor rural girls, imagine that, to give you an example, in Niger, to get through the averages, 83% of girls go to school in the city, 12 to 17% rural. That's how deep the problem is in places. And yet, for all of the difficulty, there is so much positive that can happen. I had a professor at law school who used to say when we did child abuse cases, he'd say you got to start with telling everybody that you're trying to get the less bad situation. And what he was saying is you got to start with the notion that it's messy and ugly, not because the people working on it are screwing up, but once child abuse has happened, it's kind of a negative situation. Well, extreme poverty is difficult. So everything that you're doing is going to be messy. It's going to be hard. There's going to be problems. But I have never left a country visit where I have not felt more inspired by the amazing things amazing people are doing. Education is not the Mideast crisis. This is a disease with a known cure. There are discouraging, depressing examples, but everywhere you go, there are people doing things right that are changing people's lives with the smallest amount of effort, the smallest amount of aid. Our former boss, President Clinton, used to say about the United States that somewhere there's somebody solving every problem. In the world, in the poorest countries, there is somebody, and usually many people, somewhere solving those difficult problems. And the question for us as researchers, as advocates, is how can we help understand why things work and do more of it? Now, I'm going to make 4 points here, and my first is a little bit aimed on the research side, and maybe what I'm going to say is heretical, maybe not. But I think that, what's in this study shows lots and lots of all the positive evidence. Now, about why girls' education works for AIDS prevention, infant mortality, economic growth, etc. There are also lots of, there are studies, and some of them have come out of this institution, that look at kind of broad macro issues and come up with studies, things like, well, parental income is the most determinative. Or when you have stronger economic growth, that increases demand. Or education alone is not a silver bullet that solves everything. And my response, my highly academic response to these highly academic studies is, duh. It's a highly academic response. Of course not. But let me tell you something. If you show me that in one country increasing education funding improved results by 20%, and you told me in another country it got worse by 20%, you could do a study saying it has no impact. But that doesn't tell you the story. What we really need, research-wise, is people who will help tell us why we know things are working. We know great things are happening. Why are they working? Why are they not working? I'll give you a very specific example, just so I don't seem abstract. Peer education and AIDS prevention. Okay? If you do a study on whether peer education helps AIDS prevention, I got to tell you, that will be the most meaningless study in the world. Because nobody knows exactly how to do it, or how to do it right, or what's working or not working. Now, if you did a deep analysis of 3 or 4 places where it was tried, why it worked, why it didn't, what they did wrong the first time, why sometimes peer education in the classroom works, why other times it's outside of the classroom, whether the boys and girls have to be segregated when they're talking about sex, what real people did, and you had analysis, hard, rigorous data, that is helpful. That is the kind of stuff that I think is the most needed, not stating the obvious about macro issues, because it is, as Alan Greenspan used to say to us, times where you come up with studies that are more aimed at being precisely wrong than approximately right. Now, related to that, when you're looking at education in poor countries, parental choice is, you got to think about parental choice. In the United States, parental choice is a difficult issue about whether, parents can send their kids to charter schools or private schools or tuitions and vouchers. But remember, in most of the developing world, almost all the developing world, there's nobody who's going to put you in jail for not sending your kid to school. So basically, the parent is going to choose. Now, what all the studies people here say point to 2 things. Girls themselves, poor children, girls, have an incentive to go to school. They will be better off if they go to school. Their countries will be better off if they go to school. The hard part is, will their parents be better off? Particularly if they're going to marry their girls off into another family. So a way to think about this is, how do you align the incentives of parents with what's best for the young children and what's best for the country? And the great news is, there are model after model where this is working. Now, what are the barriers that make a poor parent not send their kids to school? I'll give you 7. Direct fees for going to school. 2nd, indirect fees like, just school repair fees. 3rd, big one, opportunity cost. Your child is not around to work around the house or earn money for you. Huge one. The cost of school, the school uniforms, the books. 5, cultural barriers, particularly the notion that your girl may be married off to another family. Quality, if you don't think the school is particularly good. And 7, distance. Distance kills for at least 3 reasons. The farther the school away is, the more when you send your child to it, the less time they can help you. Secondly, the less you know about what you're sending to. And 3rd, you hear this everywhere. Either fear that your girl will be sexually assaulted, or fear that you will look like you're a parent who doesn't care whether or not she is, if they have to walk long distances, particularly alone. Now, when you do all of those things, so here's a big shocker. Where you see models around the world where people put schools close by, whether they eliminate fees completely, where the parents get to be involved, where they have decent teachers and strong parental involvement, and they not allow us enough flexibility so the child can still help around the house, you have success almost everywhere. I have heard this notion before that we have to wait for growth in education before people will demand education. That's just a joke. I mean, how much evidence do you need? Uganda eliminates fees, and they go from 3.4 to 6.5 million children in 1 year. Kenya goes from 5.9 to 7.2 million in 1 year. Tanzania doubles from 1.5 to 3 million. Of course, this is basic economics. When you lower the cost and you lower the opportunity cost and increase the perceived benefits, even where there are strong cultural barriers, they tend to be overcome. Now, again, a lot of times people will say, yeah, but just getting kids into school, that doesn't really work enough. Building schools close by does not work enough. This reminds me of the people in the United States who say Head Start works for the first few years, but then loses some of its benefits after 4th grade, who then conclude we should eliminate Head Start. If there are 5 important things you need to do to get quality basic education, and someone's doing one of them right, and that's not enough, the goal is not to downplay the importance of that one, it's to focus on how we can do the other 4. Now, on the third issue, this whole notion of what the global community should be doing. I actually believe in and have tried in my writings to fill in what it means to have a global compact. Now, start with the idea that the wrong question is, is the issue really what developing countries are doing for reform and accountability, or is it how much donors are going to give? These discussions about, does money matter, does reform matter? Of course both matter. If I can quote President Clinton again, President Clinton used to love to say, every time, he said, one of Clinton's iron laws, if somebody tells you money's not the issue, the only thing you know is they're talking about somebody else's problem. Now, money is certainly not the only answer. But the question is, and this is what I would like to think about this, is what is the relationship? Not just what is the relationship between what we in the developed and donor community do and developed countries do. Now, in Dakar, the idea was created of a true compact. Developing countries would come forward with their own nationally designed education for all plans to get all kids in school. Then the idea, and this is the words that Jim Wolfensohn made famous at Dakar, no country that has a successful plan to get all their kids in school should fail because of resources. That was the developed country commitment. It was not a commitment any more than it was in debt relief to throw money. It was a commitment that it was a compact, that if the developing countries did the right things, meaning had a plan to actually reach out to girls, to rural communities, had a plan for reform, for decentralization, for accountability of money, that if those things were done right, they should not fail. Now, the problem in thinking about this is that people operate by incentives. And if what you do is just say, well, we'll wait till a country does something good, and then a bunch of us will get together and decide whether we should help them out, you miss the relationship in the global compact. What we in the developed countries should be doing is making clear that if countries do the right things, they will have a certainty of assistance, if they do the right things. I'm not for throwing money, I'm for tough love. We have an obligation when we give $1 to make sure it actually goes to the children it should. That doesn't mean we have to impose ridiculous conditionalities. It doesn't mean that we should be a world school board. But there is nothing, but anybody who tells you there is something wrong with making sure that when you give money, it goes to the children it's supposed to, that it's not diverted, that it's not subject to waste or corruption, is not speaking on behalf of either the children in those poor countries or the reformers in those countries who are desperately fighting the powers that be to make sure that money is spent well. So the failure that we have right now, I would describe in the words of 2 ministers of education in Africa that I have heard speak. One was the Minister of Education, that's called the Secretary of State of Education in the Gambia, very tall woman, who at a forum that the World Bank was doing in Amsterdam, put up on the screen like this, the global contract on education. And she said, well, developing countries, you must divert money from the military to education. You must come up with a plan that makes sure all kids go to school. You must get rid of cronyism and corruption, all these things. Then she flipped to the next chart and said, develop country obligation, commitment. We may or may not help you, depending on how you fit into our geopolitical strategy or how our current budgets are. And she kind of turned to the crowd and she said, I am not an English common law barrister, but that is not a contract. And so let's look at what we in the United States do. We spend about, and this is after some increases in 9/11, we spend around $320, $340 million on all the poor children's basic education in all of the world. That's about what Massachusetts will spend to build 17 urban high schools this year. What one state spends to build 17 urban high schools is what we spend on all education everywhere in the world. Just recently, the United States Congress passed a corporate tax bill, a FISC bill. There were $43 billion in there that had nothing to do with anything but special interest corporate lobbying. $4 billion a year. We spend less than 10% of that on all the poor children in all the world. Now, the estimates of just by UNESCO of universal basic education, external assistance is $5.6 billion. But that's just for primary. That's if you just want to get kids 5 or 6 years. Certainly, it is probably closer to $7.5 to $10 billion if you really were serious about universal basic education, 8, 9 years. That means the United States, if we were doing our share, would be spending about $2.5 billion more on universal education. Now, I'm happy to say that Senator Clinton and Congresswoman Lowy have put forward legislation that would now do that. So at least we have a beacon out there. At least we have a start. But I think what we should be trying to do is do our part. Our part is to try to do what Larry and President Clinton and Secretary Rubin did on debt relief. There should be a clear call set from the G8 and other donor countries. Here is a substantial sum, for sure. This money is available if you are meeting certain accountability provisions, if you have an Education for All plan, and to have that kind of large announcement with head of state leadership would electrify reform. Would it make everything great? No. It would be difficult. It would be painful. There would be problems. There would be arguments. But would it move the ball forward? Yes. It would do a couple of things. It would create a positive competition. Whoever the countries that didn't win in the first round, you bet they'd be fighting to win in the second round. It would help the reformers there could now have a way to go to their heads of states and ministers of finance and say, consider basic education. I know the kids won't graduate for 10 or 15 years. You'll probably be out of office. But look what's available to you if you want to engage on that kind of reform. Now, the World Bank deserves tremendous credit, and Jim Wolfensohn, for trying to pull together on this fast-track initiative. But the fast-track initiative is just an effort to create an umbrella, a global compact where all the countries could get together and do this. The main thing that's preventing us that from happening is the lack of political will, the lack of leadership from head of state level in the G8 countries that would bring things together. My final comment is just to say the following. I have very mixed feelings about one thing, which is that our topic, universal education, is actually getting a little bit of mileage in Washington these days. But let me tell you how it's getting mileage. It's getting mileage because many in our foreign policy community came to learn that some of the people who hate us and want to bomb us were taught in extremist madrasas, fundamentalist schools in Pakistan. And so people have said, voila, we ought to care about universal basic education, at least in Muslim countries, because when we don't, the gap is filled by Saudi extremist money. Now, I'm kind of happy in some ways that that's the case, but it does remind you of the Peter Sellers movie, The House That Roars, where they try, The Mouse That Roars, where a small country tries to invade the U.S. In hope that they will be destroyed and then they'll get aid from them. Well, right now, if you want to look at U.S. flows of money, and you just were doing a chart, how do you get money? The main way you would do it is to harbor enough terrorists so that we bomb your schools. Then we're very good about rebuilding schools, or if we believe terrorists are being taught in your school. What a terrible, reactive approach to policy. The other problem with it is it looks too self-serving. People in the Mideast get it. They get that we look like we only care about their children to the extent they don't grow up to bomb our children. So if we want to take leadership, and I'll keep it in the terrorism perspective, let's have a preemption policy. We have a preemption policy, weapons of mass destruction. Let's have a preemption policy for winning hearts and minds. Kenya, the country that is talked about in the New York Times, is a perfect example. There's a country where the head of state comes forward after a corrupt regime goes out, and the first thing he says at his inauguration is universal basic education. Kenya can be the new hope for democracy. Kenya can be the new hope for universal basic education. Kenya is also on the State Department watch list for al-Qaeda and terrorism. Kenya is getting 60, 70, 80% of their kids in school in 7 of 8 provinces. In the Northeast province, they have 18% of their kids in school, which is 50% Muslim, nomadic, and extremely vulnerable to outside resources. So the question is, 5, 6 years from now, will we be going, geez, too bad we didn't act in Kenya. Too bad we weren't there to help them, because we're giving them $2 whole million right now for education. We need a preemptive approach. That means actually doing nothing more than coming forward on our commitments for universal basic education. Let's show the world not only our strategic, narrow self-interest, but in showing our hearts, in expanding children's minds, will do more to promote U.S. goodwill and foreign policy than almost anything we could do. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, I'm very honored to be part of this panel and very conscious that the time is going, so I'm going to click through my slides pretty quickly. I started off my working life many years ago now working in East Africa on education, and recently had the opportunity to work with Mrs. Ogata on refugee education, so that I know that the issue of education for all children is perhaps the most critical one we should be dealing with in the world. I am in my own little corner taking a whack at it in a different way that Fernando asked me to talk about, and it relates very much to what Jean was just talking about, the issue of investment and political will. I believe that if we are to meet the Millennium Development Goals, we will need a different vision of education in developed countries as well as in developing countries, one that promotes global literacy and global citizenship. And I'd just like to sketch for you the challenges and some of the opportunities in reaching that goal, primarily in the US today. And I will go through the challenges very quickly. We don't have any decent large-scale data on what American students know about the rest of the world, because as a country we don't care enough to actually measure it in these large-scale sample surveys. But when you find small-scale studies by non-profit organizations like the Asia Society and the National Geographic Society, they always come up with the kinds of data that people find horrifying but absolutely believe, which is American students are not given the opportunity to learn anything about the rest of the world in the current U.S. education system, with some rare exceptions. Students don't know even the most rudimentary facts about the history and geography of Asia. Teachers are not given the opportunity to learn it. And we have, our particular interest is in Asian languages, but in general we have very little capacity, very little instruction in languages. The National Geographic Survey, which compared American young adults with young adults in 8 other industrial countries, found that Americans came next to last. The last country I'm always asked about was Mexico, in their knowledge of geography and of world events, even of world events in which the U.S. is deeply engaged, in which the newspapers are flooded with information. In addition to lack of information, there are huge misperceptions. Most young Americans think the U.S. population is much, much larger than it is in fact. And we also know that American adults, I'm sorry, the panel can't actually see, I should have given you copies, greatly overestimate the extent of U.S. aid and do believe, in fact, that we are providing enormous amounts of aid far out of proportion to our even inflated population size, which isn't true. If you compare, this is very broad brushstrokes, the US with Western Europe in the sort of 70s through 90s period, even though there's lots to be done in Europe, you do find national ministries of education encouraging greater international content in the curriculum emphasizing foreign languages earlier, and introducing the subject of development education into school curricula. In the US, although there have been a number of national commissions, that should say, not commissioners, calling for international education with all sorts of the usual high-level people on them, almost nothing has happened. And it's basically characterized as many calls but little action. There have been many small-scale efforts by NGOs in the humanitarian community outside of the education system, but schools are very wary of these. They see them as advocacy, as fundraising, not as education. But I do think we are now entering a period of huge opportunity for reasons that have nothing to do with the Millennium Development Goals, but everything to do with the forces of globalization, which this group, this is really preaching to the choir, certainly knows a great deal about. But as I talk around the country, believe me, in many parts of the country, most people do not have any sense of what the forces of globalization are and what the effects are beyond the debate on outsourcing, which they've all heard about. But the economic pressures, demands for an internationally competent workforce, the national and human security challenges, the kind of September 11th effect that Jean talked about, which is a wake-up call in terms of interdependence. It's become kind of a metaphor for interdependence. Perhaps the most important factor is actually the increasing diversity in communities around the country. When large numbers of Asian or Hispanic children move into a community, the community suddenly decides that they better learn something about the area they have come from. That's a major force that is pushing schools to be interested in this issue. So even though this is really being driven by economics, it's not being driven by humanitarian concerns, I do think that we are entering a period when these issues of development, it will be more possible to get them into schools than it has been in the past. In higher education, you certainly see this. Internationalization is the major strategic priority for most universities. And President Summers has left, but I certainly use the Harvard Curriculum Review and its call for students to be globally competent and global citizens all over the place. I'm hoping that other institutions will want to copy Harvard. At the K-12 level, which is where I spend most of my time, 33 states have come to meetings on international education in the schools to look at what they should be doing, to look at what other states are doing, have begun to form networks around this issue. They are setting up the usual kind of task forces and statewide conferences and beginning to introduce new policies and programs. This is all on a very small scale because states have actually been in the worst budget situation over the last 2 or 3 years. They have since the Depression. But I think you certainly see the interest building. Here's a whole bunch of states that have issued reports in the last 2 years talking about the need to internationalize their school system. And there was one that came out recently from the Southern Governors Association talking about the 14 states in the South that are part of that organization, basically saying if the South is going to remain globally competitive, we have to radically internationalize our education system. There's a lot of national initiatives going on, which I don't have time to talk about now. From the political level, from state and defense, from private corporations, from the College Board, from Sesame Street. I mean, I think you see these are straws in the wind. It's in the air. So I think we now have a much more favorable climate for developing global literacy and global citizenship than has been the case in the past, because there have certainly been many efforts over the past 30 years to change schools in this direction. What are some approaches I think could be followed? Well, first, I don't think we will actually get development education or peace education or conflict resolution education into American schools that way. I think we have to integrate it into the core curriculum standards, and then we have to make it easy and practical for teachers who are under tremendous pressure to do other things. They need easy materials tied to their standards that they know where to find. There are lots of wonderful materials on development. Almost no teachers have ever heard of them outside of possibly the New York area. So that's sort of an issue we have to work on. I think technology is maybe one of our major resources, and there are wonderful models of schools being connected to schools in other parts of the world to do joint projects. World Links, which was a World Bank project, is one such, but they're on a very small scale. And we basically, our slogan is that every school in the US should be connected to a school in another country. Internationally themed schools is a really interesting new development. As districts are beginning to close down their old large high schools and look to create smaller themed schools, the international theme is becoming very popular. And although it may be originally seen, again, in sort of preparation for the global economy terms, once you get educators talking about what's important to talk about, they quickly move into the citizenship issues as well. And there's lots of developments going on in that area and an attempt to create a network of the several hundred schools around the country that already think of their primary mission as creating global citizens. Opportunities for teachers, I think here universities are really to be faulted and really have to work at this. Teacher preparation is the least internationalized part of any university. There have been many surveys on this, and I understand there are lots of reasons for it. But teachers cannot teach what they do not know, and so that's something that universities have to work on. Travel and professional development for teachers. I know from the Asian field, where there has been a lot of money for teachers to travel, from Fulbright and from foundations, that they turn into missionaries. And if we had more teachers visiting some of these wonderful projects that are on, from the World Bank and UNICEF that are on education, and then going home and becoming trainer of trainers or developing curricula, I think we could get that same kind of missionary approach. Community service. There's a great deal of concern about youth disengagement, lack of youth voting, civics curriculum don't work, so lots of schools are going the community service route instead. This is almost all domestic. If we could find some ways that are easy for schools to access, I think we could get a great increase in internationally oriented community service in a relatively short period of time. There's a lot of interest in it, but you have to make it easy for schools. And finally, media as an education system. Even though the mainstream television networks are perhaps becoming less international, except in wartime and closing their foreign bureaus and so on, many of the more publicly oriented radio and television networks are beginning to produce more stories from around the world. They also have made that part of their mission. But again, it doesn't connect to schools. Schools don't find out about them in an easy way. So I will end there simply to say that I think the opportunities provided by globalization do give us an opportunity to increase students' understanding of development and help to create that kind of constituency, which we are going to need for a long time because these problems are not going to be solved in a hurry. We have a lot of small models that need to be taken to a larger scale. And I think in order to do this, we need to have a serious conversation between the humanitarian community and the education community, because these are two different worlds that revolve around very different kinds of systems and have not really had a serious conversation about how we could do this in a large-scale way. Fernando, over to you.
I wanted to say this is a wonderful evening, not just because those of you who are here and because the terrific and inspiring panelists that are here with us tonight, but also because the comeback of the Red Sox makes us think that there is really hope and makes us think that maybe it is possible to fix the things that are broken with the world and be really optimistic about next week. I want to say that in listening about the challenges ahead, I want to ask two questions. And I'd ask you to do a little thought experiment and imagine that we're sitting in this auditorium 50 or 60 years ago and ask whether we could have had this conversation then. And I think we could not. And we couldn't because four very important changes have taken place over that decade. The first one is that we, as humanity, came up with one of the most wonderful inventions that is possible, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And with that invention, we could develop a moral vision, a moral compact, really, of what we hope for every human being as an expression of an obligation and solidarity. And of course, without that compact, a lot of this conversation would not make sense. But we also invented the UN system. We have institutions that allow for global governance in ways that did not exist before World War II. And I think it is important to realize that, daunting as the challenges that our speakers have presented are, we have made a lot of progress in the last 50 years. And the challenges ahead will be able to tackle them only to the extent that we have even more global governance and better institutions. I cannot imagine how we could solve those challenges if we only relied on the nation state as the only unit to address them. But I think some of what is changed also is that we have learned a great deal over the last 50 years. We have learned about the nature of these challenges. We have learned about what works. We know that the important goals in schools have to do, of course, with developing the basic literacies, if you will, but we know they are about much more than that. They're about freeing the minds of people so they can think for themselves. They're about developing the competency so they can deal with others that are different in civilized ways. And we know a few things about how to do that. We also know that how much more we need to learn, so we get better at that. So it is this awareness that we have these institutions, this moral commitment, and this knowledge that create a tremendous moral responsibility on all of us. Because when each and every one of us has to account for how we used our time, we will not be able to say we did not know about these problems. These are our problems. And we will not be able to say we didn't have the means to address them. We do. And I think one of the wonderful resources that we have are these telecommunication technologies that have really connected this planet in ways that were not possible before. The fact that we are in conversation, in community, with colleagues in dozens of countries around the world at this very time is something that would not have been imaginable 60 years ago. None of us can make progress in this field alone. You need community. So we invite you to build community, and I really want to thank our speakers. For a most stimulating evening, and thank you all for coming.